Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive from Context Education. We are so glad to have all of our amazing teachers and learners joining us. Especially because today's episode is tailored just for you guys.
Yeah.
Have you ever felt like some grammar concepts just keep coming back to haunt you, no matter how much you practice?
Yeah, definitely a common experience, especially for those who are pushing past that intermediate level into more nuanced areas of English.
Yeah.
It's like you hit a plateau and the same grammar gremlins keep popping up.
Exactly. So in this deep dive, we're going to explore those tricky grammar hurdles that intermediate to advanced learners often face, drawing insights from a really insightful guide we've got here.
Sounds good.
And don't worry, we're not just listing rules.
Right.
We're digging into the WHY behind these challenges and unpacking some practical teaching and learning strategies to help you overcome them.
I like it.
If you find this deep dive useful, be sure to hit that subscribe button and share it with your fellow language enthusiasts. Okay, ready to dive in?
Absolutely. Let's tackle those grammar challenges head on.
First up on our list is the classic villain of English grammar verb tenses.
Oh, yeah.
I think we can all relate to the struggle of differentiating between, say, present perfect and simple past, or navigating those complex future forms.
What's fascinating about verb tenses is that they're not just about memorizing rules. They reflect how we conceptualize time itself.
That's true.
Think about it. We're trying to capture this abstract, fluid concept of time through words, and that inherent complexity is what makes verb tenses so challenging even for native speakers.
It's true.
We all make mistakes.
Yeah, it's like trying to pin down a butterfly.
Yeah.
Right? And our guide actually highlights the present perfect versus simple past dilemma as a prime example.
Mm-hmm.
I know I've personally stared at those two tenses more times than I care to admit,
I feel that.
wondering which one to use.
The guide suggests a really interesting approach here, teaching through context. Instead of drilling those rules in isolation, immerse learners in stories, timelines, real-life examples.
Right.
Let them experience how these tenses play out in actual communication.
I like that.
It's about understanding the nuances, not just memorizing the form.
Yeah, I love that idea. It's like turning grammar into a detective story, where you're piecing together clues to understand how each tense functions.
Yeah.
And speaking of making grammar engaging, the guide also mentions using storytelling and journaling as fun ways to practice.
Love it.
Imagine writing about your day consciously using present perfect for experiences that still resonate in the now, or past perfect, to set the scene for past events.
Exactly. It's about making those abstract rules tangible and relevant to the learner's own world, and that's when those aha moments happen. And moving on from the world of verbs and their temporal adventures, let's step into another grammar jungle, articles.
Oh.
Those tiny words, or sometimes no article at all, can cause a surprising amount of trouble.
Oh, absolutely. I still remember grappling with the seemingly arbitrary rules of when to use the verb no article. Like, why does it go to school but go to the store?
Yeah.
Felt like a secret code I had to crack.
The trickiness with articles lies in their connection to specificity and generality.
Okay.
The Kriyun points us towards something specific, something already established or unique, while a or an introduces something general or new. It's a subtle dance between definiteness and indefiniteness that can trip learners up.
So go to school implies the general concept of attending any school,
Yes,
whereas go to the store suggests a specific store you both have in mind.
precisely. And the guide recommends focusing on this distinction between definite and indefinite articles, using real-world examples and authentic texts to help learners develop their article radar. Think of it like training your ear to hear those subtle cues that native speakers use instinctively.
And if our listeners are finding this helpful so far, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and share this deep dive with your fellow learners and teachers.
Please do.
The more we share this knowledge, the more we can empower each other on our language learning journeys.
Okay,
Ready for our next grammar challenge?
let's do it.
All right then, buckle up, because we're diving into the world of conditionals, those if-then constructions that express a world of possibilities, especially those infamous mixed conditionals that can tie your brain in knots. Have you ever tried to explain mixed conditionals to someone?
Oh, yeah.
It's like untangling a giant ball of yarn with multiple threads and time zones.
The challenge with conditionals, especially mixed ones, lies in juggling different time frames and possibilities within a single sentence. It's a mental gymnastics routine for the brain. For example, you might have an unreal past condition influencing the present.
Oh, yeah.
If I'd studied harder, I would be fluent by now.
Right.
See how it blends past and present?
It's no wonder learners find them difficult. So how does the guide suggest we approach teaching this grammatical puzzle?
The key is to break it down step by step. Start by clearly explaining each conditional type with plenty of relatable examples. Then use role play or debates focusing on hypothetical scenarios to bring those conditionals to life.
Okay.
Imagine learners debating what they would do if they won the lottery or traveled back in time. Suddenly, those complex structures become tools for expressing their own thoughts and ideas.
I love that.
Right.
That's a brilliant way to make grammar come alive. And I love the guide's emphasis on gradually introducing mixed conditionals after learners have mastered the standard types. It's all about building a solid foundation first. All right, before we jump into our next grammar adventure, let's take a quick detour into the realm of reported speech, where direct quotes transform and tenses can shift in mysterious ways.
Ooh. Reported speech is a bit like a game of telephone where the message gets passed along and subtly changes with each retelling. And those tense shifts are definitely one of the trickiest aspects.
Oh, absolutely. It's like trying to capture someone's words while acknowledging that we're reporting them at a different time.
Yeah.
It's a delicate balancing act between accuracy and grammatical precision.
Exactly. And the guide highlights the importance of starting simple with reported speech. Begin by practicing reporting straightforward sentences, then gradually move on to more complex conversations, always emphasizing the context and the speaker's intention.
I remember the guide gave some great examples of using relatable scenarios for practice.
Yeah.
Like reporting a conversation with a friend or a funny anecdote you heard.
Oh, yeah.
It's about making those grammar rules feel less abstract and more connected to everyday life.
Right. And don't forget those tricky exceptions where the tense doesn't shift, like when reporting universal truths or facts. It's those little nuances that can really catch learners off guard.
We've covered a lot of ground already. Verb tenses, articles, conditionals, and reported speech. It's amazing how much complexity is packed into these seemingly simple grammar concepts.
It really is.
Before we move on to our next challenge, I want to remind our listeners that we're just scratching the surface here. There's a whole universe of grammar out there waiting to be explored.
Absolutely. And the journey is just as important as the destination. It's about developing those analytical skills, that awareness of how language works, so you can become a more confident and effective communicator.
Well.
Right. Welcome back to the deep dive. We are continuing our exploration of those tricky grammar points that can make even the most dedicated English learner pause for thought.
And in part 1, we already navigated through a jungle of verb tenses, tackled those slippery articles, and even unraveled the mysteries of conditionals and reported speech. Phew, I'm feeling like I need a grammar break.
It's definitely a lot to process, but remember, the goal isn't to memorize every single rule.
Right.
It's about understanding the underlying patterns and logic of English grammar,
Right.
so you can use it with confidence and flexibility.
Well said. So ready to delve back into our insightful guide and see what other grammar challenges await us?
Absolutely. Let's continue our deep dive.
All right, let's shift gears and explore a category of verbs that can add nuance and precision to our language, but often leave learners feeling a bit unsure. Modal verbs.
Oh.
These little words like must, might, should, and could can express so much more than just actions. They add layers of possibility, obligation, permission, and more.
What's fascinating about modal verbs is that they allow us to convey subtle shades of meaning that might be difficult to express directly. It's like having a toolbox filled with specialized tools for fine-tuning your communication.
Right. But with so many different modals and subtle variations in meaning, it's no wonder learners find them tricky to master.
Right.
Our guide actually points out that one of the biggest challenges is differentiating between those subtle degrees of certainty or obligation. Like, when do you use must versus should versus ought to? It can feel like a guessing game sometimes.
The key here is to understand that modal verbs operate on a spectrum, a continuum of meaning.
Wow.
Must expresses a strong obligation or near certainty,
Okay.
while should suggests a recommendation or a weaker obligation, and ought to sit somewhere in between.
So it's all about recognizing where a particular modal falls on that spectrum of meaning. That makes sense. And I remember our guide suggesting some really engaging activities to help learners grasp these nuances, like using modal verbs in problem-solving tasks or debates. Imagine learners discussing a dilemma and using modals to express their opinions, advice, or potential solutions. It's like turning grammar into a real-world strategy session.
Exactly. It's about taking those abstract concepts and making them relevant to the learner's lives. And visual aids can be incredibly helpful here. The guide recommends providing charts or diagrams that visually represent the spectrum of certainty or obligation with different modals placed along the scale. It's like having a roadmap for navigating the nuanced world of modal verbs.
Wow, it's amazing how much we can express with these tiny little words. Now, from the subtle world of modals, let's venture into a grammar terrain that often feels like a vast and ever-expanding universe: phrasal verbs.
Oh.
These combinations of verbs and prepositions or adverbs can be both incredibly useful and incredibly frustrating for learners.
Phrasal verbs are truly a unique feature of English, and they add a level of idiomatic expression that can be both colorful and challenging. Think of verbs like look up, put off, take after, or run into.
Right.
They're like little puzzles waiting to be solved, but the sheer number of them can feel overwhelming.
Our guide actually mentions that one of the biggest hurdles for learners is simply memorizing all those different phrasal verbs and their meanings. It's
Yeah.
like trying to learn a whole new vocabulary within a vocabulary.
And what makes it even trickier is that phrasal verbs can be separable or inseparable, meaning sometimes you can put the object between the verb and the particle, and sometimes you can't.
Yeah.
Plus, they often have idiomatic meanings that are completely different from the literal meanings of the individual words.
Right. It's like they have their own secret language.
Yeah.
So how does our guide suggest approaching this phrasal verb frenzy?
The key, as with many grammar challenges, is context. Teach phrasal verbs in thematic groups like travel, work, or relationships. Imagine learners are planning a trip and you introduce phrasal verbs like set off, check in, take off, or look around. Suddenly, those phrasal verbs become relevant and memorable.
I love that idea. It's about connecting grammar to real-world scenarios and making those connections stick. The guide also recommends using matching exercises where learners have to pair verbs with their corresponding particles and storytelling activities where they use phrasal verbs to create narratives.
Yeah.
It's all about making the learning process active and engaging.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of exposure. Encourage learners to read authentic texts, listen to podcasts, watch movies, and pay attention to how phrasal verbs are used naturally. The more they encounter them in real-world contexts, the more intuitive they'll become.
It's like training your ear to recognize those phrasal verb patterns. Speaking of recognizing patterns, let's move on to a grammar structure that can add sophistication and elegance to our writing, but can also be a bit intimidating. Relative clauses.
Ooh. Relative clauses are those clauses that provide additional information about a noun or pronoun, often introduced by words like who, whom, whose, which, or that. They allow us to create more complex sentences with layered meaning, but they can also be a source of confusion, especially when it comes to distinguishing between restrictive and non-restrictive clauses.
Oh, I remember struggling with that distinction myself.
Ah.
It's like trying to figure out which parts of the sentence are essential and which are just bonus details.
Think of it this way. A restrictive relative clause is like a VIP pass. It's essential for identifying the specific noun we're talking about. For example, in the sentence, the book that I borrowed from the library is overdue.
Okay.
The relative clause that I borrowed from the library tells us which specific book is overdue. Without it, we don't know which book we're talking about.
So it's like a defining characteristic.
Yes.
Narrowing down the possibilities.
Right?
But what about those non-restrictive clauses? They seem a bit more optional.
Exactly. Non-restrictive relative clauses are like bonus features. They provide additional information that's interesting, but not essential to the meaning of the sentence.
Okay.
They're set off by commas, like little side comments whispering extra details. For example, in the sentence, my sister who lives in Paris is visiting next month.
Right.
The relative clause who lives in Paris gives us extra information about my sister, but it's not crucial to the main point, which is that she's visiting.
So the non-restrictive clause is like a fun fact, adding color, but not changing the core message.
Precisely. And the guide highlights the importance of teaching learners to recognize those comma cues and understand the distinction between essential and non-essential information.
Yeah, it's amazing how those tiny commas can make such a big difference in meaning.
They really do.
Our guide also mentions that you can sometimes omit the relative pronoun in certain cases. Can you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. If the relative pronoun is the object of the verb in the relative clause, you can often omit it. For instance, in the sentence, the movie we watched last night was fantastic. The relative pronoun that is implied but not explicitly stated. However, if the relative pronoun is the subject of the verb, you can't omit it.
Okay, so it's like a grammatical shortcut, but you have to be careful not to take it in every situation.
Exactly. And the guide recommends some helpful practice activities like comparing sentences with and without the relative pronoun to see how the meaning changes, or using sentence combining exercises to practice embedding clauses within sentences.
It's all about developing that awareness of how different parts of a sentence fit together and how those small grammatical choices can have a big impact on meaning.
Well said. And if our listeners are enjoying this deep dive and finding these insights helpful, don't forget to subscribe to the deep dive and share it with your fellow language enthusiasts. The more we share this knowledge, the more we can all benefit from it.
Absolutely. Now, ready to tackle our next grammar challenge.
Bring it on! Let's see what other linguistic puzzles await us.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into tricky grammar for advanced learners. I feel like we've been on an incredible journey exploring the intricacies of English grammar and uncovering some valuable insights along the way.
It has been quite an adventure, hasn't it? We've covered a lot of ground from verb tenses and articles to those elusive phrasal verbs and even the elegant complexities of relative clauses. But the journey isn't over yet.
Exactly. In this final part, we're going to step back from the specific grammar points and explore some broader teaching and learning strategies that can help learners and teachers navigate the sometimes choppy waters of advanced English grammar.
Yeah, our guide actually dedicates a whole section to these strategies, and it's full of practical advice that can make a real difference in how we approach grammar learning and teaching.
I'm eager to hear what they suggest. I think we've all experienced those moments of grammar frustration where the rules seem arbitrary and progress feels slow. What can we do to make the process more effective and, dare I say, enjoyable?
Well, one of the key principles highlighted in the guide is the importance of contextual learning. Instead of just presenting grammar rules in isolation, try to embed them in real-world scenarios. Use authentic materials like news articles, stories, songs, even podcasts, anything that shows how those grammar structures function in natural communication.
It's like taking grammar out of the textbook and into the wild where it can really come alive. I remember struggling with prepositions for ages, but it wasn't until I started paying attention to how they were used in movies and TV shows that they started to click for me.
Exactly. It's about creating those connections between abstract rules and real-world usage. And another powerful strategy the guide emphasizes is error analysis. Instead of just marking mistakes as wrong, encourage learners to analyze why those errors are happening. What's the underlying misunderstanding? What's the thought process behind the mistake?
It's like turning those mistakes into learning opportunities, little clues that can lead to a deeper understanding of the grammar concept. I've found that when learners can articulate why they made a mistake, they're much more likely to avoid making it again in the future.
Absolutely. It's about fostering that metacognitive awareness, that ability to reflect on your own learning process. And speaking of process, don't underestimate the power of repetition, but with a twist. Revisiting those tricky grammar points is essential, but vary the activities to keep learners engaged and prevent boredom.
That's such an important point. We can't expect learners to stay motivated if they're doing the same grammar exercises over and over again. Instead, try incorporating games, role-playing creative writing, prompts, debates, anything that brings those grammar structures to life in a fresh and stimulating way.
Exactly. And while practice is essential, we can't forget about output. All the grammar knowledge in the world won't help if learners don't have opportunities to actually use it in real communication. Encourage them to speak right, present anything that gets them actively producing language and putting those grammar skills into practice.
It's like learning to play a musical instrument. You can study the theory and practice scales all day long, but the real magic happens when you start playing music and expressing yourself through the instrument.
What a perfect analogy. And finally, remember that lives a language, especially mastering those tricky grammar points, is a journey, not a sprint. It takes time, effort, and a willingness to embrace challenges and learn from mistakes.
So true. It's about celebrating those small victories along the way and remembering that every step forward, no matter how small, is a step in the right direction.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive. We've explored a wide range of tricky grammar points, unpacked the reasons behind those challenges, and uncovered some valuable strategies for overcoming them.
It's been an incredible journey. We've learned so much. And I hope our listeners feel more equipped to tackle those grammar hurdles with confidence and a sense of adventure.
And remember, dear listeners, the world of grammar is vast and fascinating. There's always more to discover, more to learn, and more ways to refine your language skills. Don't be afraid to explore, experiment, and embrace the challenges.
Absolutely. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, be sure to subscribe to the deep dive and share it with your fellow language enthusiasts. We release new episodes regularly, exploring a wide range of topics related to language learning, teaching, and everything in between.
Thank you for joining us on this grammar adventure. Until next time, happy learning!